welcome to Cash and Liability Mastery. In this series, we're going to talk about debt and borrowing. What is borrowing? What's a borrowing bucket using our cash flow bucket strategy? When to borrow and how to borrow smart. First off, what is borrowing? When you borrow money, you have immediate spending power now, at the cost, however, of a future reduced spending power. In other words, you're pulling future earnings forward now because you have to pay that money back with interest oftentimes in the future. You got to pay it back with money that you make in the future. So what is borrowing? Think about it this way. On the left, we see a well-known celebrity. We'll call him Justin. And when he borrows money, he's borrowing it from his future self. Now, he doesn't know that future self yet. He doesn't know that this is what he is likely to look like in the future, but at some point he will be older in the future. So when you borrow money, think of it like I'm taking money from a future self and I'm bringing that money from the future self into the present day. So I'm always borrowing. While I may be borrowing from a bank or a credit card, I'm really borrowing from myself. And let's look at that in the context of the buckets. So we're going to add a new bucket here because in our cash flow management system, we have our 30-day bucket. That's our day-to-day spending over the course of the month. We have our 90-day bucket, which is our savings bucket that gives us our reserves. And then we have our 90-plus day bucket, which is our investing. That's where we're going to build wealth for the future. Wealth that's going to completely replenish that green bucket at some point in the future on an ongoing basis. But when I borrow, I put a new bucket called, it's a black bucket. And if I want to borrow $1,200 at 10%, understand what essentially is happening. When I borrow that $1,200 from someone else, I'm putting that in my current 30-day bucket. And I get to spend that $1,200 today. It becomes part of my current spending. Now, for whatever I'm using that money for, credit card, to buy a car, a house, it doesn't matter. It's the same dynamic. I'm pulling money forward to use it now, and I'm creating an obligation. So that red $1,200 means that $1,200 will have to go back to that bucket. And where will that come from? It will come from the green bucket here. So you'll have to spend $1,200 today, but know you're going to have to pay that $1,200 back with interest from future earnings, meaning as you earn money over time and that money comes into this green bucket, it's kind of like there's a hole in that bucket now. And let's take a look at what that could look like. If I'm borrowing at 10%, that $1,200 that I borrow, maybe I make a $35 a month payment on it. Well, that feels pretty good because it's a small amount. But in doing that, I'd pay back that $1,200 over 41 months. I'd pay the original $1,200 back plus $219 in interest. If I'm borrowing, say, on a credit card, not a personal loan, but a credit card at 21%, my payment's a little higher at $40. Doesn't seem like that much. It's only $5 a month. But it'll take me 43 months to pay it back. I'll pay back $1,200 plus $516 in interest. So let's look at how that might work. You've got $1,200 to spend today. That money moves into that first bucket for spending. Now, each month, if I'm paying $35 a month, that $35 is coming out of my green bucket. And where is it going? It's going back to that borrowing bucket. And for 43 months, that present self that borrowed money from the future self is having to pay that money back. And over time, $1,419 will be returned to that borrowing bucket. So why is this so important? Because remember, in this system, my goal is to avoid having less money in this first bucket. In other words, spending more money than I make. Because if I do that, I get to move that money forward into my savings bucket and into my investing bucket. If I have to borrow, I'm essentially increasing my current spending, but I'm creating an obligation. And that load, if I continue to borrow here, will continue to increase, making it more difficult for me to save into my 90-day bucket and eventually to begin filling up my 90-plus investing bucket. So when would I borrow? When does it make sense to borrow? Well, I'm going to put together 3 types of debts: bad debt, neutral debt, and good debt. And I'll share a basic strategy for each. Bad debt to me is a credit card, a personal loan, or a payday loan. Because in most situations, this type of borrowing is simply to allow you to spend money now that you can't afford to spend now. You're having to borrow from a future self in hopes that you can pay it back. You're taxing yourself in a way, and you're having a higher interest rate because that debt is unsecured. So it's typically used to also purchase a depreciating asset, meaning that if I buy a sweater or a stereo and I can't afford to buy it today and I have to borrow using a payday loan or a personal loan or a credit card, I'm effectively going to have that asset be worth a lot less very quickly. That sweater, once I take it home and wash it and put it on, is worth less than what I paid for it, but I'm still paying for it if I borrowed on a credit card, and the asset value is going down. So I try to avoid any credit card, personal loans, or payday loans. And as a strategy, if I have to, and I have no choice, I have a friend who had a truck breakdown. He had to do a personal loan. But instead of doing that from a high cost, he went to a friend and family member. They loaned him the money. Don't ever do a payday loan if you can avoid doing that. And with credit cards, they're for convenience. They're not an antidote because you can't afford something. They're for convenience. And a pro tip here is get a high reward credit card with no annual cost. I have several of those. I put 100% of my monthly spending on those cards, and I pay it in full monthly, so there's no interest. There's several benefits to this. It builds credit. It provides rewards and bonuses. It helps with tracking, meaning you can track your expenses and know very clearly where your money's going. And it provides insurance. Often theft, loss, breakage are covered. So use credit cards for convenience, but avoid using them beyond 30 days where you have to incur an interest expense. Pay them in full each month out of your first green bucket. Now, I consider auto loans as neutral debt. One of the reasons that I consider neutral debt is we have to have an auto oftentimes to get to work if we can't use public transit. And there's other social and personal reasons that we might enjoy having a car. Typically, the rates are pretty low, but it is a highly depreciating asset. So know when you drive a car off a lot, a new car, that asset will depreciate tremendously. So while I consider auto debt neutral, ideally you would save and pay cash, meaning keep building up in your green bucket, forward that into your yellow bucket and into your investment bucket. And when you want to buy a car, take money out of your investments and pay cash for the car. But if you can't, or you want to go ahead and borrow for a car, one of the best things you can do is know that each year that you can keep your existing car, you're maximizing its durable value and delaying the increased expenses of additional insurance and taxes and things when you buy a new car. But when you do buy a new car, think new to me, not new car, new to me car. And buy a car that's at least 2 years old. Most of the durable depreciation will be off the car. One of the best deals is oftentimes a lease that's coming off lease. It's been warranted, it's been taken care of as part of the requirements of that lease, and you can buy it at a dramatic discount. Now, there are 2 types of good debt. I think of student loans as a possible form of good debt and mortgage loans as a form of a good debt. And you'll notice I consider both of those investments in yourself. When I have a student loan, I'm investing in my education. I will borrow to invest in myself when I'm creating skills and capacities and abilities to do that. And I will borrow to buy real estate because I find that is an investment in myself as well. It's a critical part of your psychological well-being, the container that you live in. And think of it as a mortgage loan is always going to be paid if you're living indoors. If you're renting, you're just paying the landlord's mortgage. And if you own, you're paying your own mortgage. It's typically a very low interest rate. Sometimes you'll see tax benefits. And the asset you're buying is typically appreciating. If you invest in yourself, you are appreciating yourself and you are going to increase your earning power. If you buy real estate, it tends to also appreciate over time. So if you're doing a student loan or you're investing or borrowing to invest in yourself, make sure it's a justifiable return on investment. I should be able to say that if I do this, I'm going to make more money. And if I'm going to use a mortgage loan, your pro tip here is you want the longest, lowest rate possible based on your particular situation. So think about this and consider the cost of renting, because renting is still paying a mortgage payment. You're just paying someone else's payment. Let's do a quick example because this mortgage one is important. 36 to 38% of your total gross earnings tends to go towards housing. Now, if I were to buy a house for 4% as an interest rate and I borrowed $250,000, I'm going to pay $1,424 a month. I'm paying my own mortgage over 30 years. I'll pay $500,000, $512,000, and I'll also pay interest. $262,000 of those payments will be in the form of interest. Now, if I rent, and I could rent this same house for $1,250 a month, I'm paying the landlord's mortgage payment, and over that 30-year period, assuming no increase in rent, which is very unlikely, I'll still spend $450,000. Most likely that rent will increase over time, and I'll end up paying more like $600,000. Now, the difference, and the reason I say when you're buying an appreciating asset, anytime you borrow to buy an appreciating asset, you have appreciation. So if this house were to appreciate at 4%, it'd be worth $973,000 in 30 years. So if I subtract out the payments, I actually increased my wealth by $460,000. In renting, there is no appreciation I participate in. That's a true expense. Notice the difference, negative $450 versus positive $460. That is almost a $900,000, close to $1 million difference in wealth. So these decisions compound just like interest over time. One of the benefits of working with a certified liability advisor is most people spend more money on their liabilities than they actually invest for their future. So in looking at liabilities, one of the things you might want to do is what's called a total cost liability analysis. What we're doing is a certified liability advisor will look at your strategy for borrowing, how you're borrowing, good debt, neutral debt, bad debt, and come up with a strategy to maximize your net wealth over time. In our next session, we'll look at understanding credit.